Doki Doki Literature Club is not a deep game. Though it exploits difficult subjects like those of depression, suicide, obsession, abandonment, and the burden of knowledge, DDLC makes no attempt to discuss those issues in any meaningful way. Yet I still think it has some of the best writing I've ever seen in a video game. Because even though DDLC didn't bring forth any insight into any of life's mysteries, or challenge my notions of morality, I still sat deep in thought for hours after finishing it, mentally picking apart its truly spectacular technique, but in particular, its violation of expectations. DDLC's execution of horror relies almost entirely on violating expectations. It recognizes that the most reliable way to get under someone's skin isn't to try to appeal to their unique neuroses, because you're never going to be able to account for everyone's individual experiences. Instead, it appeals to humanity's most universal catalyst for fear, when something is not as it should be. And true to its word, nothing in DDLC is as it should be. From the very beginning, the player is put on edge by the highly unusual content warning. While one might say the warning exists solely for courtesy, I think the warning plays a key role in forcing the player to never feel too comfortable at any point in their playthrough. Because if they were enjoying it too much, and taking everything at face value, they might not take notice of the strange little things going on. A great amount of violation of expectations occurs in the game's medium. DDLC ostensibly presents itself as a visual novel/dating sim, but upon paying closer attention to its marketing blurbs, its interface, and its opening scenes, it's clear that it doesn't actually present as your average dating sim, but rather a caricature of one. For comparison, 2005 visual novel Yume Kusuri is marketed as an exploration of various themes relevant to high school students in Japan, and despite its excessive indulgence in sexual escapades, it accomplishes this rather well. Its opening scene also attempts to provide a somewhat tangible context and characterization, painting the player character as despondent, lacking direction in life, and attempting to fill that void by introducing colorful people into his world. But DDLC doesn't even attempt to convince the player its narrative has any substance. The marketing directly states the game is about wooing girls, and the opening scene starts by immediately introducing the player character to a potential love interest. Its presentation as an excessively shallow dating simulator clashes with the sober content warning and further discomfits the player. But most of this would probably go right past the average player, who had most likely never played a visual novel before this one. DDLC remedies this by setting up 2 hours worth of expectations in its first act. The narration is simplistic and devoid of substance, the characters are cardboard cutouts of stereotypes, and the player character won't shut up about his desire to get in bed with one of the girls. But some of the first signs that things are not as they should be show up in the poem writing minigame. Surprisingly heavy words appear in the player's selections. One of the girls is noticeably missing from the interface, and some words correlate with the girl you didn't think it would. During poem sharing, the poems are surprisingly well written, and the writers all have strong justifications for their artistic choices in their poems. The poems stand out from the vapid narrative happening outside of them, and before the player knows it, they start taking the poems seriously, removing themselves entirely from the surface-level story. The climax of Act 1 makes use of several different violations of expectations, combining them into a single impactful moment. It starts from Sayori's confession, where neither accepting it nor rejecting it helps ease her pain. In fact, rejecting it causes her to scream in despair, something entirely out of left field for a supposed shallow dating sim. The next day, the poem she submitted for the festival has effectively changed into her suicide note, and Monica, who would have knowingly put the poem into the pamphlet, seemed strangely unperturbed by it. Prior to checking in on her room the second time, an expectation had already been set once before. Screen goes black, you call out to her, and you enter her room uneventfully. But of course, this time... While most players like to talk about the shock value and emotional impact of this scene, I think by far the most important thing in it is how it establishes a new precedent for the player, the futility of choice. Up until now, DDLC had been playing at a standard visual novel branching storyline, where the player's choices focuses the story more on one of the girls until their romance is complete. But with the simple act of advancing the scene without the player's input, DDLC demonstrates its willingness to actively remove the player's agency in its storyline, forcing the player to second-guess whether they are really in control of the narrative. And remove control is exactly what it continues to do, as the second act starts violating every expectation that was set in the first. The goal of Act 2 is to forcibly separate the player character from the player and establish them as distinct identities. DDLC accomplishes this primarily by intentionally destroying immersion and suspension of disbelief, forcing the player to constantly remember they are playing a game. It starts with the error messages in Sayori's suicide, continues with the constant glitches, and is especially demonstrated by the altered scenes, which the player character has no reaction to even though the player is fully aware of the change. The most egregious example would be when Yuri is shown cutting herself, followed by the game rapidly reversing the scene and simply continuing as if nothing had happened. But in this second act where crazy is starting to become the new norm, one thing stands out, like a doctor in an asylum, untouched by the madness surrounding it. Monica had already been prodding at the fine line that separates the player character and the player. Her very existence is an oddity, from her name, a simple Japanese transliteration of a Western name, to her regular comments leaning on the fourth wall, to her conspicuous lack of a route despite her flirting with the player character. She's also the only one who seems to recognize how messed up the situation seems to be. But her status as the only unaffected character in Act 2 is in itself the violation of expectations. Her existence is a reminder of what used to be, of how things should be, and how they aren't right now. Yet more infuriating is that she clearly has some power over your situation, so why isn't she bailing you out? The first time I played DDLC, I wanted to put my faith in Monika, to believe she could use her power for good. But as the game continues to strip away the player's ability to choose and railroads you onto her path, it slowly becomes apparent that she is not here to help you, and you are truly alone. This brings us into the game's final major violation of expectation, the third act. While the third act's narrative function is the resolution of the plot lines that had been brought up before, the mechanisms by which it achieves that resolution function along similar lines to the previous two acts. After you're forced to spend your weekend with Yuri's mutilated corpse, Monika swiftly dummies her and Natsuki out of the game, and removes the player's last semblance of control over the game by not even giving the player character any lines of dialogue. At this point, the precedent that Sayori's suicide had established comes full circle, with the player apparently having absolutely no option but to simply sit and stare into Monika's eyes for the rest of time. But Monika's mention of her character file serves to break this notion of helplessness and remind the player that, yes, they are still playing a game, but this time, that's a good thing. Once her character file is deleted, Monika slowly corrupts and fades away, and restores the other characters back to their initial state. But once you start your new game and reach the end of the first day, Sayori indirectly reveals that Monika was not the villain. Rather, it was the position of club president. Where the player was led to believe that one of the characters was responsible for the evil in the game, it turns out that the very nature of the game brings sadness and despair. Thankfully, nothing makes sense in these games, and Monika just comes back and saves you, but her final act is to shut down the literature club, leaving nothing but a goodbye note. When it comes down to it, Doki Doki Literature Club's story is nihilistic. It covered a series of unimportant events only made interesting by how they were corrupted and debased by a jaded club president and the epiphany the game bestowed upon her. Nothing in DDLC mattered, and Monika's inability to live with that only made everything worse. But in having such an inconsequential narrative, DDLC was forced to be inventive with its horror, and inventive is exactly what it was. It created dread and suspense in an environment which by right should have suffocated any tension within it, and it accomplished all that by exploiting a fundamental human fear while shedding comparatively little blood. Where games often try to create horror by having the player empathize with an on-screen character's suffering, Doki Doki Literature Club remembers to cut out the middleman and inflict that suffering directly onto the player. The wonderful thing is, that's not the only thing I love DDLC for. I loved its brilliant meta-commentary on the nature of writing. I loved the allegories hidden throughout all its poems. I loved how it took stereotypical characters and gave them purpose, context, a reason. I love how it took a genre I'd become so jaded against and made me love it again. To be sure, there's a lot to love DDLC for, but I couldn't spend all my life talking about that. I'd be no better than Monika. So I leave you with my words of wisdom and bid you all adieu this autumn. Happy Halloween, and see you around.